Welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. Today I was inspired because we recently did a short episode comparing a few different graphics cards and introducing the concept of price to performance ratio in the context of shopping for a graphics card. So the response was so positive on that episode, I thought, why don't we get into some of the other details when you're trying to shop for a graphics card about how to make the right decision, because frankly, there are so many options out there. So the first thing we're going to look at today is frequency, okay? A lot of people will compare two graphics cards based on frequency as well as the amount of RAM. So I have two cards up on the screen here today. One of them is a GTX 560 Ti. This is a PNY card. It costs about 210 bucks after a mail-in rebate. You can clearly see here, this is an 822 megahertz, 1 gigabyte graphics card. So that means it has a 1 gig frame buffer memory-wise, and it is a DirectX 11 graphics card. So it's over 200 bucks. Well, what about this one? We've got a GT 430 for as little as just over $50 after an MIR. It's clocked at 700 megahertz, which sounds pretty good. It's got 1 gig of RAM, and it doesn't say it in the description, but it should. It is also a DirectX 11 graphics card. So how do you compare these products against each other? I will show you how. So too often you have a customer come in shopping for a graphics card and they say, oh, I want a 1 gig DirectX 11 graphics card. Well, here's the news. The GT 430, while it is 1 gig and while it is DirectX 11, performs less than 1/4 as well as a GTX 560. So I used my same crisis benchmark. I got 10.5 frames per second on the GT 430, and I got 48.9 frames per second on the GTX 560. So it is almost 5x the performance of that GT 430, giving it better price to performance, just flat out way better performance, and in spite of that similar sort of marketing checkbox feature set. Now this becomes even more pronounced if you're trying to compare an NVIDIA GeForce card to an AMD Radeon card, or vice versa. You can't use simple things like clock speeds, memory amounts, memory speeds to compare these graphics cards. It's just not that easy. So why do some graphics cards have more RAM? What is the RAM on there for? Because really that's the one that I'm focusing on more than anything else today. This guy's got 1 gig of RAM, and this one, at the very, very high end, a GTX 580 has only 1.5 gigs of RAM. What is memory for? So the memory on a graphics card stores whatever it's working on, much the same way that the memory on your system stores whatever the system is working on. So if you are running a huge image, you're rendering this huge image, 2560 by 1600, big old high resolution thing. It has to store all of the textures, all of the things that it's working on in the frame buffer or in the memory of the graphics card. So as you get into higher and higher performance graphics cards, you are going to get more and more benefit out of added memory. But there is a limit. So I'm going to show you guys another case study where I've actually got two GTX 580s with me. One of them is a standard reference 1.5 gig, the one I had before, and one of them is an aftermarket non-reference PCB 3 gigabyte GTX 580. And I'm going to tell you guys how they perform against each other. Now in my crisis benchmark, my standard GTX 580 scored 64.5 frames per second, and my 3 gigabyte GTX 580 scored 65.2 frames per second. That is a minuscule performance difference, considering the fact that this card costs $90 more. Now, that's also not even to say that that performance difference is from the RAM, because the 3 gig card is actually clocked a little bit higher on the core. Now when you're comparing two otherwise identical cards, like we're doing with these two GTX 580s, you can compare specs like clock speed and memory clock speed in order to figure out which one will perform better than the other, because they are otherwise identical. So the thing about memory, like I said, when is it useful for? Why do these products actually exist with tons of memory? Well, here's the scenario. Here's why you need a GTX 580 3 gig. If you're the kind of guy who's going to be running 3D vision, or not even 3D vision, if you're going to be running NVIDIA Surround on 3 30-inch monitors, you need at least 2 cards for one thing, okay? And the thing about SLI is when you take two cards and run them together, you don't actually get to double your frame buffer. If you have two 1.5 gig cards, both cards have to store all of that data that you need for that giant 12 megapixel image. So if you run two cards with 3 gigs of memory, then all of a sudden both GPUs have 3 gigs of usable memory. Now, the thing about memory is that clearly you can see when we double our memory, we don't get some kind of incremental performance increase. But if you run out of memory while you're trying to draw an image on the screen, well, while your graphics card's trying to draw an image on the screen, your frame rate will tank. So while at 1080p in Crysis 2, we see absolutely no difference between these two cards, if we're running 3 times 2560 by 1600 in whatever game it happens to be, because really, most games are going to need a lot of RAM at that kind of a resolution, it might be the difference between 40 FPS and 4 FPS. Because if you run out of memory, it's going to start swapping back to the hard drive, which, as you can imagine, is quite a lot slower than the actual graphics card memory on your video card. So how do you find the right graphics card for your needs if you can't just look at basic specs and you can't just look at memory amounts? Because it ain't that simple. Well, the reality of it is you have to read or watch reviews. So you can watch videos on YouTube, you can visit review sites, you can visit user forums. My personal favorite is www.hardwarecanucks.com. They do video card reviews, they do CPU reviews, SSD reviews, all kinds of good stuff. And then if there's anything they haven't reviewed, you can actually post in their user forum and get other people's opinions, because for a lot of cards like a GT430, there might not be a lot of comparative results out there, so you might have to rely on other end users' experiences with that card to find out if it's right for you. So hopefully you've learned a little bit of something today, and please let me know in the comments if this has changed the way that you will shop for a graphics card next time you walk into, say for example, Best Buy, and the guy tries to sell you a 1 gig graphics card. Actually, sorry.